Professor of History and Politics at the University of New Brunswick, St. John. She is an historian of 20th century Canada with specializations in Atlantic Canada, the Great Depression, women religious nuns, suffrage, and youth. Her publications include the co-authored monograph with Rosa Bruno Joffrey and Elizabeth Smythe, Vatican II and Beyond, The Changing Mission and Identity of Canadian Women Religious, and the forthcoming We Shall Persist, Suffrage and Human Rights in Atlantic Canada, published by UBC Press. We are delighted to have Heidi MacDonald with us this evening, and especially because this is International Women's History Month.
Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, even on a dark and rainy night. I still love to be in Halifax and in the archives. I worked here in part-time in the early 90s, and it was very formative. It helped me, I think, to become a good historian, just as did John Reed, I might say, another professor to whom I'm grateful. I have to be careful to speak into this for the live feed, right? So even if you can hear me, that's not good enough necessarily, right? Okay. So last year marked the 100th anniversary of the Nova Scotia Franchise Bill of 1918. This is the first part of the bill, which enfranchised a large group of Nova Scotia women, and which was obtained only after many decades of fighting for it. I worried about how the commemoration would go, because the media was interested, but you know how the media talks in 15-second sound bites sometimes, never more than 5 minutes on a topic like this. I worried about how they would present it, but I was pleasantly surprised. I was pleased that they were cautious, especially about that Indigenous women in Canada didn't get the vote for another 42 years. And I was really happy when they didn't say, my expectations are low, you might think, when they didn't say that women got the vote as a reward for their war effort, because nothing drives me more crazy than that analysis. So I was pleased. I was pleased with how the 100th anniversary of this act went. It wasn't shown as being final. But still, there's one thing that can't come through in that kind of commemoration, and which I hope to bring through tonight, is what can't come through, what the media won't be able to tell us in that kind of commemoration, is how long and contentious the road to women's suffrage in New Brunswick was. And I'd like to just give one example of how this message still isn't out, surprisingly. And this is just bits of the bill. I should show you as we go along. That bill, just as you see in blue, inserted male and female. That's what it did. It kept all the other requirements the same. There were still property requirements, and those are outlined here. But I wanted to show you this because this has admittedly changed, but the Canadian Encyclopedia Online until 2016 was still giving this description for Nova Scotia suffrage, describing it as a lackluster campaign all across the Maritimes. It gives a little more credit to Quebec, but I don't know why they even include this entry as Quebec in the Maritimes. It doesn't make sense to me. Anyway, they have just changed it, and that's encouraging. So, identifying when the campaign for women's suffrage started is subjective. And don't worry, I won't say it started when the earth cooled. But rather than give you a date when it started, I think I'd rather give you 3 early examples, and I think that you'll be able to see that the thread pulls through from those examples. And the first one relates to Brian Cuthbertson's findings. I'd hoped he'd be here so I could thank him. That Nova Scotia colonial elections between the first election in 1758 up to 1851 included, or at least did not exclude, women. Women who had the property, age, ethnic, citizenship, and religious qualifications. If they had those, we have examples where they did vote. In 1793, for example, at least 6 women, likely recently arrived Loyalist immigrants, voted in Windsor, Nova Scotia. John McLeod helped me find this specific document. The county sheriff commented on their eligibility, observing it was good, in his words, if women have the right to vote. It remained uncertain, however, whether women did have the right to vote, but their votes that time were counted. And we have another example in 1806 in Amherst in a by-election. The unsuccessful candidate, that's always who we hear from, not the winner, Thomas Law Dixon, complained that several women and persons having no legal qualification had voted against him. But the legislature rejected his claim, and those votes stood. Only in 1851 were women explicitly excluded. Second example of early suffrage interest is Joseph Howe's raising of the issue. Although somewhat tongue-in-cheek, his 1834 editorial entitled Petticoat Politicians put forth the benefits of women's suffrage. I can't tell how serious he was, but noting that while petticoat governments were usually a source of humor, he argued for an experiment to see how women would do as voters. He said they surely wouldn't be worse than male voters, and they were so physically inferior to men that if there was a problem, they could be easily overcome. So, admittedly, this is a double-edged kind of comment. It's not a clear endorsement. But don't you think it's significant that he raised it in a well-read newspaper? It suggests an interest nearly a century before any suffrage bill was passed. So I'm going to offer it as one of my 3 examples. In still keeping in the mid-19th century, a third example of early suffrage interest was the increasing opposition to British common law and the principle that married women were economically, legally, and politically represented by their husbands. You may have heard of this in the phrase, under British common law, upon marriage a couple is one, and that one is the husband. You might have heard that, or women experienced a legal death. And that was a system that lots of people were happy with. Women were legally represented by their husbands. Husbands voted for their wives on behalf of their wives. In 1832, Judge Beamish Murdoch defended this principle, explaining that a family's property and wages formed a collective fund from which all members benefited. And that included a husband's responsibility if his wife were to incur debts. Contrary to this ideal, many Nova Scotians recognized women's financial, physical, and mental vulnerability to irresponsible and cruel husbands, and some of them pushed back by agitating for married women's property laws. And they agitated for married women's property laws exactly at the same time that women were excluded specifically from voting. I think not a coincidence. The first attempt at a reformed married women's property law, remember, unmarried women can hold property. It's married women who can't because of the British common law understanding. But the first attempt at a bill was in Nova Scotia was 1855. It was modeled after the New York Married Women's Property Bill. It failed in 1855, but it was attempted in the legislature. It collapsed. Other versions collapsed until a milder version passed in 1866. It wasn't a law that we would maybe brag about today, but for all its shortcomings, it opened the door for more reforms. It also, and here's where the long and contentious part of my argument is that this Married Women's Property Act agitation drew on a deep well of hostility to women's rights, including enfranchisement. And this bill was, in Nova Scotia's bill was considerably weaker, the 1866 one, than similar acts in provinces such as New Brunswick in 1851, which completely shielded wives' assets from husbands, and Ontario's. Not until 1884 did Nova Scotia protect wives' assets in functioning marriage. Until that time, Nova Scotia only protected wives' assets in dysfunctional marriages, specifically where the husband deserted. And of course, the empathy was to a woman who brought property into a marriage or earned wages and brought them into a marriage, and then the husband squandered them. And drunkenness was often associated with this. So those were the first women to consider being affected. By 1884, it had expanded. I believe it's key for historians to consider property laws and enfranchisement as closely related human rights. And this is underscored by how the passing of that 1884 Married Women's Property Law in Nova Scotia created a more conducive political context for suffrage. And suffragists, we say in Canada suffragists rather than the Americans say suffragettes. You'll hear me say suffragists. Suffragists in Nova Scotia, just 3 years after that Nova Scotia Married Women's Property Law, they went for the first municipal suffrage bill. Again, no coincidence. Because laws on property and laws on property are so connected to what does enfranchise a person, what is considered to make a person worthy. So if this had been sorted out in property, it was time to address it for enfranchisement. What proportion of the population believe this? I'm not saying the majority, but some. The most empathy municipally was for single women who were paying taxes. Single women who were paying taxes had no husbands to represent them at the polls in that ideal situation that probably wasn't, I don't know, 50%, whatever. I always think my parents regularly cancel each other's vote outs at the polls. I'm sure they did it. I'm sure they did it Monday again. So, single women taxpayers had the most empathy, and in Nova Scotia, a municipal franchise for property women passed pretty easily in 1887, right after that Nova Scotia Women's Property Bill, Married Women's Property Bill passed. And I have to say, as in a kind of a broad statement, that we are talking middle-class women and men here. This is where the concern is for middle-class women and men. It's not for poorer women. That's yet to come. It's another reason why it's a long campaign. The opponents for the municipal franchise bill, there were opponents. I said it passed relatively easily. The opponents came forward with the same arguments that we will then go on to hear as I read the documents. The same arguments they use for years, that exposing women to the crowds at the polling station will isn't an experience women should have to go through. The situation was always covered by British common law. It's not womanly, it's not feminine to vote. Voting could give you facial hair. They threw all of these out. Just, the Bible was against it, then some people said the Bible was for it. The suffrage arguments are never very interesting, and they seem so obvious to me that people have already made up their mind and they're using whatever they have. We do know, I should say, the municipal vote was largely restricted to white settlers and middle-class women. It probably only included about 5% of the population as eligible. It was a wedge, it was not a full step by any chance. And we do know that one African Nova Scotia businesswoman voted in the first election after the 1887 municipal vote, Louisa Ann Johnson. Judith Fingard wrote a DCB article on her. This Nova Scotia municipal vote was part of a national and a transnational sweep, you might say. Numbers everywhere remained small, but they were soon followed in New Brunswick and PEI. Here's again some of the opposition toward the municipal bill was that it would lead to more women voting, and that would be dangerous. Some people said, well, it's okay for those single property women to vote. They are paying taxes. We don't want to get in a situation that caused the American Revolution, taxation without representation. We were pretty sure we were against that. So those single property women could vote. The opposition to that was that what if it led to more women wanting the vote? Well, that's exactly what it did, and that's what the women who fought for it hoped, and that's what happened. Because from that 1887 municipal vote, you go right to a series of provincial votes. We think of the provincial votes as the main fight, I think, don't we? We think certainly the focus is on that in the literature. I'm hoping, and I've written a book that's in revision stage now, and that will argue that it's we need to take the focus away from just the provincial vote and just that very end of it. That's what I think we've made a mistake in doing that. So, municipal vote, I'll say women's property law, municipal vote, and then you get a series of suffrage bills in the 1890s. That was the suffrage campaign in Nova Scotia is all about the 1890s. The most serious agitation, the most petitions, the most everything happened in the 1890s. It did not happen in 1917 and 18 when the vote was actually won. The real fight was in the 90s. And there are 5 bills at that time. One of those bills in 1893, I'm going to mention it now, and then I'm going to go quickly through those 5 bills. But one of those bills in 1893 passed second reading. It got caught up in some plain old skullduggery. You couldn't call it anything else when it was refused by the Law Amendments Committee. But it got through on a vote of 19 to 17 a few months before New Zealand brought in women's suffrage. Nova Scotia really was almost the first. We can blame J.W. Longley about that. I'd like to blame him in more detail. I'm going to take a small sidestep now to the Women's Christian Temperance Union. You knew they were going to come up. The WCTU were originally founded in the U.S. And in 1873, they quickly spread to the Maritimes. They established several branches in Nova Scotia in the 1870s and the Maritime branch in 1878. And temperance societies were not new to Nova Scotia, but on this scale, the WCTU was unprecedented in its scale. It was non-denominational, though Protestant, and you'll see that the suffragettes are significantly, predominantly Protestant too. Where the WCTU quickly intersects with suffrage is that, remember, founded in 1878, in 1890, they had a suffrage department, an enfranchisement department. And you'll recognize the first person who led it. Edith Archibald of New Glasgow was the first president of the WCTU suffrage department. Her successor, you will also recognize, her successor in the franchise department was the equally capable Mary Chesley, who's known for taking on J.W. Longley, who I said I wanted to pick on some more. In 1895 alone, just to tell you the scope of the WCTU in the franchise department, Mary Chesley organized 14 petitions with over 10,000 signatures, just in 1895. The WCTU members endorsed the franchise for two broad reasons. It was a basic human right, and it was a tool to achieve reform, prohibition, of course. Their large numbers spread throughout the province were a potent force. Tens of thousands of petitions from the WCTU to the Nova Scotia House of Assembly in the late 19th century kept suffrage before politicians. They could not ignore it with all these petitions literally landing on their desks. I think I have here's a petition, 1878. This is before the franchise department. A petition, pretty clear. It's not couched, it's not about temperance, but we demand the political enfranchisement of women as an act of justice, 1878. And here's these 5 bills I keep referring to. I'd like to go through them really quickly. It's not the most interesting thing, but I have the excuse of my thesis being that this is a long and contentious campaign, so I have to show you how long it was. The first 4 suffrage bills were put forward in the House by the same person, Albert Hemian. He was a merchant and Justice of the Peace and Liberal MLA for Queens County. He was of German and Loyalist heritage, elected to the House in 1887 at the age of 44. And he would have presented the 5th one, no doubt, but he died in 1896. His motives remain unknown. I so wish I knew more about Hemian. And if any of you know more, shout out anything you know right now, because I couldn't wait another minute. You'd expect him or his wife to be involved in temperance or other reform agencies. I can't find him involved in anything else. But he's very involved in suffrage in the House, bringing forth these 4 bills. His first bill, and the basic story of his 4 bills were that he tried the first time with a pretty open bill, giving men and adding women to the roster and giving them the suffrage on the same basis as men, which meant property qualifications, ethnic requirement, no Indigenous people living on reserve. And then, when it failed, and it never failed by much. Look at that first vote. That was enough to encourage the suffragettes, and you can picture, if you didn't know the results, you could picture in 1891 that the suffragists would say, well, with a little tweaking, this is pretty manageable in a couple years. But what happened was they would tweak and reduce. So the next, in they reduce and reduce to the point that in 1894, they're back to the same qualifications as municipal vote, which is only single women, single and property women. So does that make sense? They start out hoping for a franchise the very same as men. Then they say the next bill, well, because it fails, they'll say, well, just single men. Sorry, just single women or women with a large amount of property. They tweak it. The fact is, after that close vote in 1893, the suffrage opponents aren't going to accept anything. That's what it really looks like to me. Tweaking is irrelevant. So while the advocates go for tweaking, the opposition just says no, no, no. I actually think that one of the reasons that Nova Scotia's suffrage campaign is so long and contentious is because of that early success. I think that early success in 1893 actually scared the opposition into a full court press or a full offensive. I think if it had crept, that they never wanted to see that happen again. If it had crept up a little bit, it would have been interesting. But that's, I'm doing what historians are supposed to not do. I'm speculating. Certainly in these 5 bills, J.W. Longley was the biggest opponent. He was a fierce opponent. I should just show you before I talk more about Longley, though, that this is that moment in 1893 where it passed second reading, and it's in the Halifax Herald, other newspapers, and it's like, this is what happens. A bill passes, is introduced in first reading. It goes to a vote after debate in second reading. And then if it passes, it goes to a committee normally, and that committee normally rubber stamps it, but not this time. J.W. Longley was the head of the Law Amendments Committee, and he was having none of it. So just a reminder that the biggest opposition for women is in 1895, because I'll just go back. In 1895, you can see there's two close votes, and in 1895, J.W. Longley again puts forth an amendment to the bill. So there's a bill proposing that women be eligible to vote. He puts forth an amendment to defer. It's always a condescending kind of, well, we just don't think we're quite ready if we just had another couple of months. But of course, an amendment to defer for 3 months means it's off the docket, because that's how long the legislature or the House of Assembly sits. Anyway, J.W. Longley. Mary Chesley, the superintendent, who I already mentioned, of Nova Scotia's WCTU franchise department, got fed up with Longley's shenanigans. And Sharon MacDonald has written more about this. 10 days after this 1895 defeat, she published a scathing attack of Longley in the Halifax Herald. She shredded his defense that he was protecting women from politics, and this is what she wrote: with due gratitude to Mr. Longley, picture a lot of sarcasm here, for his chivalrous desire to save us from self-destruction, we will take the risk of the strain upon our delicate moral fibers of depositing a ballot once in 4 years. And she went on and on. That is fun to read. These suffragists are often criticized, and the WCTU is often criticized for middle-class elitism and privilege, and their desire to control the working class. And there's truth to that. I do think that Mary Chesley was an exception. She's more of an equal rights and pacifist person. She demanded the vote as a human right. I would not put her in the same category of those suffragists we criticize for being out of step with reality. I don't get that impression from her. Now, I've mentioned the WCTU, I've mentioned Mary Chesley. I have to, of course, now turn to another important organization to suffrage, and that's the Halifax Local Council of Women. They are founded just 1 year before this scathing attack, and so they are founded partly in defiance of Longley and his opposition to having women in public life, because they are very much about women in public life. After the WCTU, the local council was Nova Scotia's most prominent women's reform organization. By the 1890s, it too, the local council of women, had tied its standard to the vote. They weren't officially pro-suffrage, but the executive members, and you'd recognize a lot of the names, including, here we have Edith Archibald, a prominent member. She hosted the first meeting of the local council of women, partly because she was a friend of Lady Aberdeen's. The WCTU, the local council of women, you likely know, was an umbrella organization for women to network, and for all of these little groups to come together, or not necessarily little, because the WCTU was one of them, and agitate for reform, thinking that they'd be more effective as one common voice. So at the very time that Longley said women need to stay home and not strain themselves, 40 representatives of 43 different organizations founded the Halifax Local Council of Women, many of them church groups, 24 non-denominational but implicitly Christian. They were organized around issues such as temperance. The Halifax School for the Blind was a member. The Protestant Orphans Home was a member. The Halifax Sketch Club and the South End Tennis Club were members. It was a wide group, and they were together. I have to be clear, not specifically for suffrage, but an awful lot of them believed in suffrage. Their goals were broadly defined reform. And in this pretty tough context of the 1890s, with Longley and suffrage opposition being at a high after that close vote in 1893, in that context, they were careful. They didn't go for big reforms in the 1890s. They went for reforms that would benefit women and children. So reforms such as purified milk, pasteurized milk. Am I too early for that? The pure water, clean food, public health. Now, the local council of women and the WCTU both had their internal challenges too, and didn't the press or the opponents love to jump on that, to say that was the best thing that could happen for the opposition to suffrage, to see that the women were disagreeing amongst themselves. Well, they can't even agree among. I mean, if men didn't agree amongst themselves, we'd never say take the vote away from them, or should we? We wouldn't. So I showed you those 5 suffrage votes in the 90s. I don't have time to tell you in detail, but the 1890s were a very hot time for suffrage, and you had these 2 prominent organizations as well as individuals. You had smaller things going on that we can't quantify, women talking in families or smaller groups. Or I've written a chapter on PEI. Just a quick aside. In PEI, it's impossible to find the documentation on this because I really think the province was that much smaller. People spoke directly to their politicians. There's all kinds of support for suffrage we can't identify. Anyway, this was the 1890s, high time for suffrage support, but also some frustrations at these repeated repeated failures, close calls in the House of Assembly. You see in 1897, after that vote in 1897, you see a lull. And I do think it's tiredness. I think it's just tiredness. The movement, the leadership in the movement wasn't spread among a large number of people. I think many of them got tired. I think many of them were also naive, partly because of their middle class status. They didn't think that this would be such a difficult fight. They thought that if they were well intentioned and that they had their middle class good manners and a certain status in society, they didn't think this would be complicated. Well, it really was. And so I described the next phase in the suffrage movement. I see a real lull of about 10 years from the end of the 1890s to in the first decade of 1910. And I suspect there was some agitation, but it wasn't public. So there's a lull we see both in the Halifax Local Council of Women and the WCTU. Their energy wanes for about a decade. They don't consider it, like what they're doing isn't working, even though they're working really hard at it. And so they seem to take a bit of a break. The Halifax Local Council of Women even considers disbanding. They decide not to, but their activities go way down. Then we see a rally, and by 1913, before the war begins, we see especially a rally in the WCTU franchise department. The same people are still involved, and in this case, it's Mary Chesley. She reports that more local branches were selling suffrage pamphlets, engaging in suffrage debates, and recording votes that showed often unanimous support for suffrage at the branch level. Mary Chesley gave annual updates to members in the Maritime WCTU Journal and annual minutes. She felt that change was in the air, and she was even sure of victory by the next year, by 1914. She says, "I cannot think of any other reform in regard to which there is so great a cause for encouragement." She's really encouraged. The Halifax Local Council of Women was similarly rejuvenated with they had some new affiliates at this time. The YWCA joined them, the Ladies Musical Club, and St. George's Anglican Church joined them. They were gaining membership again after a definite dip. The Local Council of Women even hosted the annual convention for the National Council of Women in the summer of 1910. And that was a crucial, probably their most important meeting ever, because they did nationally, formally endorse suffrage at that meeting. Simultaneous with their hosting of that annual meeting, the Halifax Local Council of Women revived campaigns to appoint women as municipal school board commissioners. I attach that very much to the pathway to enfranchisement, to ask for women to be eligible as school board commissioners, a right that had been held by rural women since 1881. The Halifax Local Council of Women worked hard on the campaign to make women eligible for school board election. They referred to it as a matter of social justice and consistency, and especially for the well-being of the children. It always helped. If you could make an argument, it was the well-being of the children. They prepared an exhaustive report on women school board appointees, appointed a committee, and lobbied politicians in 1911. But there they pulled out of the campaign, fearful that they didn't think it was strong, they had enough support for it to pass, and they worried that it would backfire and hurt everything, hurt their suffrage support. So that was an interesting moment for the Halifax Local Council of Women. The lull was over, but it still wasn't a safe, sure thing at all. And in fact, only in 1917 did women win the right for appointment to school boards, and none were actually appointed until 1935. That's a very slow campaign that limps along. Eliza Ritchie preferred certain successes. She was a strategist. You could call her conservative. That's one way to interpret it. Another way is to say that she was strategic, and if something wasn't going to win, she didn't want to be any part of it. Interestingly, she put the kibosh on the local council of women having a mock parliament. So you can read in to have one and had a venue, and their proceeds were going to go to the Halifax School of the Blind. And Eliza Ritchie pulled the plug and said this could backfire on us. Now, I told you that sometimes the women didn't agree themselves, and here was a case where some members of the local council of women in particular were getting frustrated with this caution, and especially Eliza Ritchie's caution. And so, some members of the local council of women started a separate organization, a suffrage that was specifically about suffrage. Here, this isn't happy to report. The local council of women didn't like that someone else had a suffrage group, though, and they started their own and made Eliza Ritchie president and promoted Ella Murray, or demoted Ella Murray, who was the president of the other suffrage association, to librarian, which wasn't encouraging, though we know that librarians are very important. So, this takes us up to the eve of the First World War. I'm closing in. When war was declared in July 1914, Nova Scotia did have a suffrage association. It was on a shaky foundation, admittedly, but there was a suffrage association. But suffrage advocates suspended all suffrage activity, at least in the early days of the war, committing 100% to the war effort. And several people have written about this, including Ernie Forbes, who point out that the local council of women, the executive, almost moved over to become the executive of the Halifax Red Cross. The local council of women threw themselves into war work, and especially Red Cross work, and as you know, Halifax was a real center because of its location and its naval importance. So as the war dragged on, it wasn't thought to be a long war, but it clearly, after a couple of years, some bits of life returned to some normalcy, and people commented, some of those suffragists, that other provinces and countries were starting to pass them by. One of the younger members of the Halifax local council of women said Nova Scotia was falling behind Manitoba, Alberta, and Saskatchewan that had all granted qualified women the vote in 1916, even though there was a war on. British Columbia and Ontario were also on the cusp of giving women the vote. At this point, the Halifax Local Council was representing 3,500 women through 41 affiliated societies, and they unanimously voted to resurrect that 1910 statement in support of suffrage. They let it go, but they put it back on the table while still keeping up their war duties. It was by no means one or the other. Early in 1917, the council called on the legislature to grant women's suffrage on the same rights as men. They lobbied politicians, they distributed suffrage pamphlets, and simultaneously the WCTU set a goal of 40,000 signatures. There were public endorsements by prominent men and women. Some towns, including Wolfville, held special meetings to publicly demand suffrage. Local newspapers published mostly positive reports of suffrage debates in the US and Britain, and as well as depictions of the responsible behavior of the newly enfranchised women in the American states of Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado. None of the Nova Scotia pro-suffrage organizations or newspapers were radical, but the demand for change, but their demand was widespread. New energy came from the sight of newly enfranchised women in Canada and around the world, and the confidence women won as they labored as a crucial part of the war effort as volunteers, nurses, war industry workers, and relatives of men serving overseas. The Halifax Local Council spearheaded the drafting of a new suffrage bill in 1917. It was presented to the legislature. It got through second reading. It unanimously, and I wish I could stop there. But would you believe in 1917, the long and contentious road to women's suffrage was not over? Because in 1917, despite a unanimous vote in the legislature for suffrage, it was turned back by the Law Amendments Committee. Once more, few could imagine defeat in this context, and yet it was. What happened is it went to the committee and nothing came back. And a week passed, 2 weeks, 8 weeks passed. And at the 8-week mark, 8 high-profile Nova Scotian women suffragists, including a lot of the names I mentioned, Eliza Ritchie, Edith Archibald, Mary Chesley, they addressed the Law Committee in mid-April 1917. The dauntless Edith Archibald addressed the elephant in the room. She said, "I scorn to think that the Law Amendments Committee would slay this bill after having allowed it to reach its present stage without a word against it." But they did. They, after that unanimous second reading, the Law Amendments Committee gave it the hoist, the phrase insisting that time was insufficient to complete necessary revisions to the draft. Well, they'd sat on it for 8 weeks. The Liberal government's resistance flew in the face of the previous unanimous support, and it's hard to say anything other than it being duplicitous and misogynistic. I know we're not supposed to judge our values of the past, but that seemed a clear one. This determined defense of male privilege suggests that Eliza Ritchie's caution all along had been correct, that Nova Scotia was unfriendly and dangerous, and the political context was unfriendly and dangerous. For 3 decades, she had focused on campaigns that could be won, which put her at odds and made her look conservative. But this was the very backlash that she was dreading. And she, after showing caution for so many years, she was now in her 60s. Some of these women who'd started the campaign in the 2 decades earlier were now in their 70s. Some had died, including a name I didn't have time to mention, but Anna Leon Owens had died before this final stage. So Eliza Ritchie had an opportunity to respond to a letter to the editor, which had agreed that this was best to wait on women's suffrage. We didn't want to rush anything. This letter to the editor said, she responded, she had had enough. This was her breaking point. And she said women had been asking in good faith and earnestness for their fair share, nothing more, in the rights and duties of citizenship, and they ought to be considered. And she went on. Before the next spring sitting of the House of Assembly, however, December 7th, 1917, a day you all know, the Halifax explosion interrupted every aspect of life in Halifax and in Nova Scotia. 2,000 people injured, 900 blinded, 25 left homeless. This event did, however, turn the tide of suffrage, because after women's response and the Red Cross's response and all those connections to the LC Local Council of Women to the relief effort of the explosion, that was finally too much for anyone to ignore. After that, suddenly to be against women's enfranchisement for politicians shifted to be something they could lose votes for. So in 1918, there is another bill, the final bill, the one that the 100th anniversary was of last year. The government of Nova Scotia promised to give Nova Scotia women the same voting rights as men. That vote, the one I showed you the copy of at the beginning of this lecture, wasn't based on universal suffrage. It did have property requirements and ethnicity requirements. Women had required $150 in property or proof they were ratepayers, and if they were married, then their husband had to prove $300 of property so that there'd be room for two to vote. But that vote, that bill finally did pass easily at both second and third readings, but its passage by that point wasn't even marked because of two things: the continuing occupation with the Halifax explosion, but also the frustration of the women. Like, really, you're not going to get us out to celebrate this after all that it took. So, even after 1918, when the province's women were generally believed to be enfranchised, still much remained to be done, as historians and feminist activists have rightly and increasingly recognized. Qualifications as to property and race excluded many women. Indeed, many suffragists shared prejudices that rejected full inclusion for poor, Indigenous, and Black Nova Scotia women. The suffragists in Nova Scotia, it wasn't their mission to gain the vote for all women. They showed their own prejudice. Restrictions were only gradually dismantled in the face of often fierce resistance, and there were even more decades to come for Indigenous women to gain the vote. The age requirement was another change that came down from 21 to 18. The franchise is evolved. It continues to evolve. There's not much left now. I think in 2004, incarcerated people, it's 2004 or 7, are now allowed to vote. So it wasn't over in 1918, but it was a major step, and it's a turning point. So restrictions were only gradually diminished. I won't go any farther. I hope that I've proven my point that suffrage in Nova Scotia was long and contentious. Thank you. I'll just leave this up. This is one of the petitions that's on the archives website. It shows the whole petition, but Mary Chesley is the first name. The petitions are fun. You can see the occupation. She listed her occupation as homemaker. I'm happy to take questions if you have any energy left.
Jim?
I enjoyed that very much, Heidi. I'm wondering, when you looked at the 1890s, and you had basically the 5 bills, and you had the list in the newspapers of who voted for what is the split in terms of party lines, or was it a free vote?
It was always a free vote, and so Longley was a Liberal, and so the opposition, yeah, it was often the same parties were voting. It wasn't party line.
block, essentially. The Liberals voted against, and
No, I meant the opposite.
oh,
That it was a free, what is that called? Free vote, isn't it? Yeah. That they did not, it wasn't that the Liberals were for suffrage or the Conservatives were against. It was mixed up, yeah.
all right.
So you could have people within the party fighting. And that happened in all 4 Atlantic Canadian provinces. It was never one party that tended to bring it in.
Wasn't Longley a president of this organization? I seem to recall in our newsletter, I'm wondering if it was during this period when he was that active, and I believe he's in our list of presidents too. It's interesting, I'm familiar with the literature, with Catherine L. Cleverton's A Woman's Suffrage in Canada from the 1930s, and then Carol E. Bocce's study of suffragists, and then a lot of this other research, but they all seem to corroborate the thesis that I think Cleverton's term was small c conservative and cautious movement, particularly in the Maritimes. And Carol E. Bocce emphasized the class orientation and the fact that the suffragists in English-speaking Canada were disproportionately drawn from the upper classes and the club women, most all friends of, I guess, of Lady Ishbel Aberdeen. And then there's been a lot of discussion about the working class, the relative absence of working class women from this movement. So I guess my question is, where do you fit in all of this in terms of the theoretical interpretation of this? Because you could argue that what you just presented was a rather conservative line of argument, because it took forever, it was contentious, and whenever it came to a critical point, they chose the discretion is the better part of valor. Let's not bring it to a vote, let's put it away, it might cause a controversy. Sounds pretty conservative to me.
Well, if we could separate, so Catherine Cleverton, look, and I just popped this up when you were talking. This is, this, until a year ago, this book, published in 1950, was the only book that looked at the suffrage movement in all of Canada. And it is used over and over again. It's still used. And I've even had my summer vacations ruined by seeing in Calgary, there's Heritage Park in Calgary. They have a display on with women getting the vote in each province, and they lift from Catherine Cleverton. So
Perennial thesis of Princeton.
from 1950, and this book has been, like, you wouldn't believe how influential this book has been in the absence of other research. So she says, I just find that she had a conclusion before she started, is what I find. That's a strong thing to say, but the way she talks about the Maritimes is so, it's all about, well, this is what you'd expect to happen in the Maritimes. And so I'm getting to your question. There's a few structures that affect her conclusion. One is it's not a structure, it's her own bias, and then the people she interviewed, their bias toward the Maritimes. It's all 3 provinces. Like, she says some strong things about the Maritimes. She also, and other historians do this too, make a big deal about how late the Maritimes is compared to the West. Well, it's not. 1918 isn't 25 years after 1916. That really frustrates me. And that's a really common thing in the suffrage literature, that the West led the way. Well, they got the vote a couple years earlier.
starting to tell us now.
Yeah. Yeah, I lived in Alberta for 19 years. I just got out in January. Is this good? I think more than conservative or progressive, I think when studying suffrage, you must consider where starting before World War I. And I think Catherine Cleverton put such emphasis on the 1910s. She has a little bit about the 1890s, but if you talk about suffrage in the Maritimes, if you talk about suffrage in Canada in the 1890s, well, Alberta wasn't even a province till 1905. The Maritimes are leading. It just depends where you start. I think it's extremely important here that the suffrage story must include the 1890s. That's a no-brainer, isn't it? There were 5 suffrage bills. And then I would take it back earlier. I gave you examples from the 1830s. Well, I don't think that many people would agree with Catherine Cleverton anymore if they knew a little bit about suffrage. And they would take the debate back farther and see that it's a contentious, longer campaign. That's my main argument. I very much argue with her in this quote, "Nowhere has the traditional conservative of the Maritime provinces." I mean, that's a loaded statement. That's what I mean that she's concluded before she started. More apparent than political rights for women. It was natural that these provinces should exhibit varying shades of apathy. Well, huge shades of apathy. Okay, but was it conservative? Yes, the people involved were interested in getting the vote and their strategy was to get it for middle-class women because that's where the argument was easiest. That's not exactly the same as coming from a position of conservatism, but that was the low-hanging fruit. There's no question that the lowest hanging fruit was the municipal vote for single property women. I think it was a logical place to start. And that's going to be no help to working class women. So I hesitate to put the term conservative on it, but the concern was definitely for the middle class. I hope that the intention was to bring it to all women, but I can't prove that. So have I completely evaded your question?
Oh, I think we got a clear.
Okay.
You suggested in the end that once women were granted the right to vote, that there were certain restrictions, including the $150 proof of property, and that then the husbands had to prove 300. So that, just forgive my ignorance here, meant that that same law applied to men, that they also had to prove.
Yes. And I have to, and it did change soon after. It changed 2 years later, but just, yes, it did. It was the same qualifications as men, which required property,
Okay.
150.
So my question is, as the restrictions were lifted on who could vote and under what conditions, were they lifted equally for men and women, or was that done on a sort of tiered basis?
They were in Nova Scotia,
Okay.
but there were variations, and including in municipal laws. But provincially, the answer to your question is when they were lifted. The property qualification was lifted from both women and men. But that property qualification is, it really evolves. It goes in each of the 4 Atlantic Canadian provinces. The property qualification could go on property qualification for women, but not men. But in the specific case you asked about, it's lifted for both. But I just don't want to say it's always that simple.
Around the sort of racial restrictions, ethnicity,
Yes.
were those lifted equally?
Indigenous, Indigenous men and women living on reserve only got the vote in 1960. Yes. Nova Scotia never had exclusion to African Nova Scotians. New Brunswick did for a short time. So there, it's fairly complicated to talk about. And if I can, you didn't ask this question, but if I can say that there's no, that I can see, there's no maritime or Atlantic Canadian suffrage movement. It's 4 separate ones because they're trying to get, the purpose is to get a bill through the provincial legislature. And therefore, it's perceived to be a waste of time to be part of a regional organization because that just draws you away from having to please the particular politicians in your province. That's who you have to lobby. So there's no broader movement as I see it.
John?
I have 2 questions, if I may, that are quite different. But first one is there was a lot of reporting in the newspapers here of the sort of direct action tactics of the United Kingdom suffragists. And I'm just wondering if there was a sort of strategic discussion in Nova Scotia as to whether those tactics could be adopted. Obviously, the people you're citing would have been very much against them, I presume, but I'm just wondering if the issue was discussed. And the second question really picks up on the 1890s, and I'm wondering if there's any evidence, there may not be, of sort of the tenor of the debates among the men in the legislature, particularly the ones who voted in favor of suffrage, and clearly somebody like Kenyon was committed. What about the others? I mean, did they get angry when Longley did what he did, or did they sort of go to the gentleman's club and sort of say, well, good old J.W. or whatever, you know? Do we have any sense of how committed these men were, or was it more of a side issue from their point of view?
I don't have evidence to answer the second question, but it sure is an interesting question. And maybe another way to say it was, how deep did their suffrage support run? Were they? There's no question that some were interested that if women did get the vote, then would they vote for them? So that was pretty motivating. I really don't have, and I feel at this point, I would have had this, I have the same answer for this question that I would have had 3 years ago, whereas 3 years ago, now I could answer lots of other questions better, but I'm scrolling through my mind, I can't think. But the militant British suffragettes, I can comment for sure. And you know, the press had a lot of power in the suffrage debates just by deciding what to include from other news. And when they chose to include news about the British militant suffragettes, it was implicit in those articles about the British suffragettes being violent, having to be force-fed or being force-fed. I can't remember her name, the woman who threw herself in front of the king's horse. When those, and broken windows, I mean, there was a constant supply of stories, and especially around 1908. 1908. Have any of you seen the movie Suffragette? Meryl Streep is in it. This is what we're talking about that era. So they had the press had a lot of influenced by what they reported on then used. The militancy was used by opponents to say, look, what will happen? It's implicit in the newspapers when the newspaper chooses to run so much that it's a cautionary tale. It's chilly. Yeah. So, but your question was more specifically about whether these were ever considered, and they were never openly considered in all of the minutes that I read. Though the closest of the 4 provinces is New Brunswick, where Ella Hathaway, who's a St. John suffragist, Ella Hathaway said comments in the minutes of the St. John Women's Enfranchisement Association. She says, something to the effect of, I can see why they're breaking windows and doing that stuff, and if I was there, I think I would be too. That's the only comment I've seen. But it was very powerful and it was very present, and I feel that this contradicts what I just said about there not being a broader suffrage movement. This is an exception, and the militancy of the British suffragettes was a great fear here.
I'm curious about the 1851 date that you mentioned that explicitly denied voting rights for women. Was there a precipitating event that led to that, or was it just more of a closing of a loophole?
I think it's exactly the second thing you said. It's a closing of a loophole, and I think it had come up in, we know at least a few contested elections. Do women have the vote or not? So it was a closed loophole, and 1851, and it happens again in the 4 provinces. I know Newfoundland wasn't a province then. I'm calling it a province. But it happens around the same time, within a decade, in all 4 provinces. There never appears to be a precipitating factor, but it seems that it's a closing of the gap.
Could you talk a little bit about the language or the arguments that were made in support of suffrage? Did it break down here in a similar way to other parts of the country where the maternalist arguments were made as opposed to equal rights arguments?
Yes, they definitely were more maternalist arguments. Though I ask myself if that was a strategy or a real belief. So the proposed arguments were that if women, the strongest arguments were that if women could vote, guaranteed they would vote for good, because women are more morally pure than men, and they're more connected to the next generation. They're more connected to the welfare of children, and therefore you can trust women to vote well. And there's lots of images about women in housekeeping and corruption, and that's why, and prohibition especially, women will vote for what's good. They won't just vote to continue corruption. So yes, I'm answering all your questions in too many words tonight. But the short answer is yes, they were maternalist arguments, but I don't think we can take it entirely seriously. Some of them were rights-based, some of them were, but more of them were maternally based.
Well, the language of the bill you showed, it was about on an equal footing with men.
Yeah, and social justice, or justice was
Yes.
used, yeah. So that, more maternalist, but justice, the word justice it is justice. That does come up too. But you can imagine when women are trying to get the vote, I think that they soft pedal and say, do this for the next generation, do this for children. Mothers are the mothers of the world, this is the proper thing.
It's a more palatable argument.
Exactly. More palatable as mothers than as citizens. Yeah.
I'm sure that if you have any additional questions, that Heidi will stay around for a few more minutes. But I just want to say thank you so much for a fantastic lecture. And I know that for me, having just gone to vote the other day, and not really as aware as I should have been about the challenges and the fights the wars that were waged to allow myself and all of us in this room to have that privilege. So in future, this will be on my mind when I do.
And can I just say, you're a really good audience. Thank you. That was really a real pleasure for me. So thank you very much.
And just before I let you go, I will remind you that on November 20th at 7 p.m. our next lecture is by Stephanie Sloan-White, also of the University of New Brunswick, and her talk is entitled Comprehending the Complexities of Community and Class Integration at Graham Creighton High School, which I'm sure will also be fascinating. So thank you very much for joining us this evening. Thank you, Heidi, for a wonderful lecture, and look forward to seeing you next month.